The fundamental thought behind having established, uh, the guild was catalyzing civilizational progress. And 5 years back, or even 3 years back, if you'd asked me, did I see building a rocket company? My answer would have been no. My plan was to go ahead and become an astronaut, stay in the US, and explore the cosmos in ways that was traditional in nature as we see today. But things changed over the course of time. I've met wonderful people, including my co-founders, the team that we've built at the Guild, and I think every decision, every choice that I've made at every different point in time has led me here. So we'll start with how important this very industry that we rely on is, and why reusable rockets are the future and why they are important in the first place. So 400 million years back, as life, we'd mustered the courage to venture out of the oceans, and we're on land, and look what we've built, right? We've built rockets that could put a man on the moon, and we've also built some of the tallest structures, and including monuments that have lasted thousands of years. Now, 400 million years later, we've mustered the courage to now venture out of land into orbit. So essentially, people who build rockets are nothing but logistic partners, right? So probably in the 1800s, when we had cars come up, and then cars became a normal. Then we had flights come up. Then flights became normal. Now we have rockets, and we've somehow ended up in reusability, and now that is becoming the normal. So the first ever rocket that we sent into orbit was nothing but a bigger missile. Right? It was all the efforts of war and whatnot. And through the Cold War, we kept sending objects into orbit, starting with the Sputnik one. Then NASA ended up putting a man on the moon. We've built a space station. That means ever since the space station was in orbit, not all humans that were born on Earth have always been on Earth. There was always somebody manning the space station. So we were already a species that was not restricted to our planet alone. Now, there are several areas. I mean, when I say catalyzing civilizational progress, what I essentially mean is we need to build technologies that directly move the needle for humanity. Now, this can be energy, it can be nuclear small module reactors, and it can be reusable rockets. It can be something that can even solve for food or even carbon capture. But those are the areas that we need to focus on. But as far as space goes, ever since the first rocket that was put into orbit, we've come a long way. But when did we ever think about, commercializing orbits and commercializing space as something that is of regular access, right? So in 90s and early 2000s, when we saw the telecom industry and the network industry wanting to have more and more satellites in orbit, we saw that the frequency of bigger rockets were not enough. We also observed that the limiting factor for bigger rockets was the fact that the lead time to build these rockets and to make sure that these were full was very high. Because if you needed a commercial use case, you always wanted to operate the rocket at full capacity, much like a bus. If a bus is running empty, then you're not making any money out of it. So then we thought, okay, we'll leverage the emerging electronics industry, and we miniaturized satellites so that they could be accommodated onto smaller rockets, and then we launched them into orbit. But this increased the project cost from 2001 to 2004 by 25%. But it didn't matter much to the satellite industry because that's how constellations of satellites now took birth, right? 10 satellites were now performing the function of a single satellite. The latency, the network coverage area, the swath, everything was excellent. But the question remained, were we ever able to build a successful business out of small satellite rockets? And the answer till date remained no. To an extent where the founder of a company called Rocket Lab, Pete Beck, back in 2013 when he founded Rocket Lab, he'd said, if we ever build a bigger rocket, I'll eat my hat. Right? And in 2022, he put his hat into a grinder, he ground it, and he ate it. And he said there are several things that we did right and several things that we did wrong. And that's how they announced Neutron. Now, it was quite obvious that we had to move in the direction of bigger rockets because that's where economy of scale made sense. So the only thing that had to be solved from an engineering perspective was how do you go about making sure the lead times are smaller? And that is only possible if you could reuse your vehicles. So SpaceX figured, okay, the combination of bigger rockets and reusability is the key to reducing the cost per kg. And they brought launch costs down significantly as well. But with the advent of Starlink, we saw that there was a huge favor, or it was more of a favor that is being done to the commercial space industry, with all of these upmass being skewed to one particular set of satellites. So the only way to solve for this was if we could do one better and see how we can make the entire rocket come back and reuse them. So the fundamental issue that has existed over the last few decades, we all remember the space shuttle. We saw that the space shuttle, once it was in orbit, it had to come back. The only governing issue was the reentry heat. Refurbishing a space shuttle costed about $1.1 billion, while a new one only costed roughly about $800 million. And we thought, okay, this is not a very economically viable solution. So we thought, okay, why don't we just solve for this? And this is fundamentally the issue that is being faced by Starship as well, because we are conventionally going along with thermal protection systems and heat tiles to bring the upper stages of the rocket back. We thought, we'll not fight the re-entry heat. How about we redirect that and utilize it in a different way? That's what we built. We built from scratch a completely new rocket engine feed cycle that allows us to redirect the reentry heat throughout the reentry phase, and which also, when coupled with our deployment system, can operate in both vacuum and atmosphere. So this ended up giving birth to Razer Crest Mark 1, which is the world's first fully reusable medium lift launch vehicle. The rocket can put roughly about 24.8 tons into the lower Earth orbit, which is about 400 kilometers in expendable configuration. And we can do about 22.8 tons to LEO in partially reusable and about 8 tons in fully reusable. We can also put roughly about 6.8 tons on the surface of the moon. So why is this a significant step in our evolutionary progress, right? Now, we feel like we very strongly believe that the next 20 years is going to be a very important timeline in our civilization's history, because the kind of upmass that goes, and even geopolitically, the more orbit space that you have as a country, the more power you hold. Today, US has, and particularly Starlink has, one of the highest number of orbital paths and cleared for them. You can treat orbit almost as if it is real estate. We need more and more satellites to be in orbit. Today, everything that we do has to do with space. Be it surveillance, be it network, even banks decide whether or not to loan a farmer based on satellite data if the soil is fertile, right? So that is the level of dependency that we've gotten into today. And this will only keep increasing. But responsible use of orbits is also a very important task. To bind it in a nutshell, it should be harnessing the power of space for all life on Earth. And as a country with such civilizational heritage, I think it is our responsibility to contribute to this as much as we can. As a country, we've been a part of this journey in the form of ISRO for the last 55 years plus. And as a part of ISRO, we've put, as a country, roughly over 500 tons into orbit in the totality of roughly about 15,000 tons in the last 70 years of humanity. We'll keep pushing boundaries, and it all ties back to one thing. I grew up listening to the Vedas. The fundamentals of our very existence is nothing but curiosity, right? And that is one thing that has always driven humanity beyond what we know. So I think the very fact, or the very statement, which is Ekam Sat, which translates to there is only one truth, is nothing but change. And you can observe change, you can inflict change, and you can affect change. I think that has to be done at a deeper level in every industry that we set our foot in. And I'm only hoping that each and every one of us continues to push the new needle more and more towards civilizational progress. Thank you so much, guys.